Good morning, everybody. I apologize that you had to move back inside, but I was very diligent and prepared a PowerPoint, Okay, note to self, not always a good thing, okay, for future presentations. But anyway, at least we have a little change environment and give it a little different feel. But I actually like, my name is Jana Robinson. I'm Space Security Program Director here at the Prague Security Studies Institute. And I will discuss our activities down the road, but I actually focus this presentation on NATO, but I think we will end up talking about space beyond NATO, because as it will be revealed throughout the discussion, a lot of the things that are done in space are in the national purview. But I actually like the lineup of lectures today, because we're talking about the economic and financial domain, the space domain, and then later on we're going to talk about cyber. And I think if we are talking about these domains in military terms, these are, I think, very decisive domains in terms of 21st century warfighting. And I think when Roger mentioned that, we know the least in terms of ENF, how that will play out, or how states will utilize the domain. We know a little bit more about space, especially a few countries, and then we probably know even more about cyber. So space is kind of in between ENF and cyber in terms of the way we utilize it. But I think what all the domains have in common is information. And when we talk about 21st century warfighting, we talk about the ability to access information, process it, and utilize it. And in that sense, space is critical in support throughout all other domains. But so I will first, I think, talk about why we talk about space maybe more, or why is it coming out of the classified environment more than in the past. So I think I'll talk briefly about that, and then we will talk about how space in terms of how it supports NATO, and then is space a priority for NATO, or should it be? And then maybe, I think the answer will be obviously yes, but maybe in a sense, where the discussion stands today in terms of the priorities. And then we can look, how could we move toward a more comprehensive policy within the NATO? And then I will briefly mention what PSSI is working on, and then we can discuss other things that are maybe not directly relevant, but all kind of be encompassing into and have a NATO relevance. So I will first start with the overall landscape, so to speak. So when we talk about space security, what we talk about? We talk about the ability to access space, utilize space, meaning have safe and secure on-orbit operations, and safe return from space, if you talk about civilian activities, and that all these operations to be free from physical and radio frequency interference. Because I think what is clear, that today we don't conduct independent space operations, meaning we don't have people conducting operations in orbit independent from the landscape on Earth, meaning all space operations are conducted from the Earth. And that's obviously very important, because those links are part of the security equations. But what I wrote is technology and geopolitics are changing. I don't think I have to talk about how geopolitics are changing, because I think all of your previous lecture kind of outlined that. But in space, if we talk about technology development and geopolitics, again, we've got the same three countries of relevance: United States, Russia, and China. And then you've got other actors that can be disruptors in one way or another, and commercial actors that also can serve as disruptors in that. But when we look, we have, and the US likes to use the terminology 3 C's, congested, contested, and competitive. It's now changing a little bit, but that's back in 2012 they came up with this 3 C's idea. So when we talk about congested, there are about, now it's almost 1,800 active satellites operating in space. From that amount, it's about 800 of those satellites are United States. About China has over 200, and Russia over 140 active satellites. So that just gives you a sense. And I also have to mention space debris as a hazard, because no matter if you conduct civilian, commercial, or military operation, space debris is there always, and it actually became quite a problem because the United States and the Soviet Union has created a lot of space debris throughout those decades of operating. And actually, we will talk also later, China had an event that increased that amount. And what happens is that they're big pieces, but they break up into smaller pieces, and then they create a lot of tiny pieces. But even the tiny pieces, I'm talking about 1 centimeter and smaller, they can actually be very dangerous to satellites, multi-million-dollar satellites. That's why everybody's very concerned about these hazards. And we will, in that connection, we will later talk about space situational awareness and why that is very important to monitor space debris, but also other activities. I will also mention what has changed a little bit from the past is that I will actually skip maybe the contested. I will go to the part of competitive first. So in the past, of course, the Soviet Union, US, only countries operating in space. Then we've got countries like China, Japan, European countries coming out into the scene. Now you see over 70 countries and governmental consortia operating in space. That is obviously changing the way we have to view that landscape. And what is also interesting in the past few years is what they call new space. And that is especially visible in the United States, but other parts of the world, especially in Europe, they're also looking into that. But I think what is interesting there is that people, it almost started as a contest between billionaires in the United States. Elon Musk and Bezos decided, they want to go into space. They want to invest in launch technologies and then other technologies. But what is interesting is access to space is very critical, and it's also very expensive. So it's actually quite interesting that these companies went into this business because they saw the opportunity that the government, and especially during Obama administration decided they're going to invest some money into commercial enterprises to create more competitiveness in the launch industry, to reduce the price of price per kilo or per pound to space. So, and today we see companies, you probably know, SpaceX, launching satellites not only commercially, but what is unprecedented is that they got contract with the U.S. Air Force to launch government satellites. So we have moved into different equations, but it's not only launch. We've got other areas. For example, Earth observation, where you've got companies like Planet that are operating over 100 satellites, and they are providing more and more data and also analytics. And again, not only for commercial purposes, but also for governments and for militaries. And this I think is very, very interesting, because in the past it was mostly telecommunications companies that were provided services to the military, for example. But now it's going into other fields, and I think that is also going to play into the security equation, because it's one thing to reduce the cost of your operations by using commercial services or you can host payloads on commercial satellites. And the other thing is then how do you play that into the security equations? How do you protect those commercial assets? And I think this is now coming as a very interesting topic too, that those big defense contractors, the commercial companies, are now discussing more and more with the militaries is how they can better protect their assets. So we've got another issue when we look at the competitive space. In the past few years, the phenomenon of small satellites has become very, very high on the agenda, because what some people think is that if you want to, let's say, increase resiliency of your space infrastructure, rather than launching a very large multi-million-dollar satellite and then have it there for 15 years without the ability to update software, and fix the hardware and stuff, well, maybe you want to launch a number of smaller satellites that you can interconnect and create a better resilient infrastructure and services that can be updated maybe faster. And this is an interesting idea. That's part of it on the security. On the other part also, companies think that by providing these small satellites and large constellation of small satellites, so-called mega constellation, is that you can provide services that were not available before. For example, internet to remote parts of the world. But what that means, for example, if today we have 1,800 satellites, they're saying that maybe in 2-3 years we can have 3,000 satellites. It doesn't seem like a lot, but if you are to monitor it on a 24-hour basis globally, it's becoming a problem. Also, a problem with these is we've got limited availability of orbital slots, and we've got limited availability of radio frequency spectrum. So these will take up more of that, and these are finite resources, so these will have to be considered. Secondly, these smaller satellites, for example, they don't last that long, because they're simply smaller, cheaper, and they don't have such a big resiliency for years. So they say they have to be replaced within 3 years, which is not enough. What if they become non-functional? They become space debris on their own. So we've got all kinds of new great ideas, but we have to weigh them against the risks that are happening. And the space community is actually struggling with this a little bit in terms of how to embrace the new technology push while preserving safe environment and secure environment. And we've got other things in technology that are coming on, like new electric propulsions. Normally, orbital mechanics lead the way your satellite operates. That's why satellites are very predictable in their paths, which of course then we can talk what that means in terms of security as well. But when we've got these new electric propulsion systems that are coming up basically now, is that these satellites will be able to maneuver in very different ways. And that will complicate how do you predict their paths, how you can make conjunction analysis, or how you can basically, also you can raise risk by doing that if you're not very, very careful. So these are all things that coming on in terms of the competitive. And it's very interesting. For example, India was last year in one launch, they launched 104 satellites in one run. So they were like one large satellite with 740 kilograms, and then about 100 smaller satellites of 10 kilos each. So imagine that in one launch they do that and deploy that, and suddenly you're trying to get situational awareness of all those satellites. And when we talk about situational awareness, we've got the United States, which has a very good so-called space surveillance network. But what you have to do to have a global presence in terms of the ability to monitor what's in orbit all the time, you've got to have radars and sensors globally, all across the globe. So even if the United States have a lot of assets globally to do that, they still don't have perfect awareness, because you're looking at vast areas like international waters, but like worse. And so that what the U.S. military, so right now they provide a service to themselves, meaning to the military, but also to allies like Europeans, Japan, and others, and also commercial companies. And this is done by U.S. military today, and they're monitoring, they say they're monitoring today about 20,000 objects. They track them larger than 10 centimeters. They're improving that now with their space fence, and they are going to be able to monitor, objects below 10 centimeters. But again, if we're talking about launching this much active assets plus monitoring debris, we've got a pretty big daunting challenge just for operations there. So, and then you add to that the contested space, and that one is, I think, quite interesting. And what has changed, I think, from the past, I would argue that space domain has always been contested to a certain extent. A lot of people argue, well, space is such a nice sanctuary and we should keep it that way. But when you think about it, since the beginning of the space age, space was used for military purposes. The first overflight of satellites was to get a good sense of where those Soviets had their silos, missile silos. We've got, so from the beginning, but what changed, I think, is that over time, the United States and the Soviet Union has created some kind of understanding what's good to do in space and what's not. So, for example, in 1962, both countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, made nuclear detonation in space. Well, pretty soon they realized that's not such a great idea, because you don't only kill the asses of your enemy, but your own too, because the electromagnetic pulse you create just destroys. It doesn't differentiate, if it's a friendly or enemy. So I think that's hence, 1967, Outer Space Treaty. What does Outer Space Treaty ban? Nuclear weapons in space. Okay. But the problem with Outer Space Treaty today is that all it bans. It doesn't ban conventional weapons, and then we will get to another problem. What do you call a weapon in space, right? Because space technology is inherently dual use, and that complicates the discussion on that. But I think when we talk about contested space in a military terms, again, the main concern from the side of the United States and allies is Russia and China. Russia, because they have had decades of developing technologies, and China is because of their surge into investment in all range of space-related technologies. They're investing in everything. They're not selective. They're testing them, and they're not deploying them, and they're sometimes using them. And we will get to the problem of, how can you curb that? So for example, if we talk about, we've got several problems. We've got the most obvious, threats, for example, like ground-based kinetic anti-satellite weapons, which all three actors have. In terms of China, for example, in 2007, you probably heard that in 2005, 2006, they did some ASAT tests, but they were not, successful in terms of, actually hitting something. But in 2007, they hit their own old weather satellite, but unfortunately they did it in the altitude of 495 kilometers, which is very bad because those debris don't go down into the atmosphere, they don't burn, they stay there. So by that one kinetic shot, they increased the amount of space debris by 20%, which was shocked the international community, because by then everybody thought, well, we kind of know that we got to protect the space environment, but after after the Chinese event, everybody was like scrambling, saying, oh wow, we've got to talk more about space governance because we have a problem. I don't think we're all understanding the fragility of what we're dealing with here. And what was more surprising is that 2 months before that test, the Chinese signed the Interagency Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, which are international guidelines that basically tell you how you should conduct your space operations in order not to increase space debris. Anyway, so that was kind of even more insult to injury. But after that, they conducted other tests, and for example, in 2013, it was concerning because the Chinese got the fact that it's probably not good to actually do a test that you hit something. So the following tests were only tests in the vicinity of the targets, okay, no more hitting. But in 2013, their asset reached all the way almost to the geostationary orbit, and they caused a lot of concern because geostationary orbit is home to the most valuable military assets. That means, the infrared sensors for missile detection, military telecommunication satellites, very valuable ISR assets. And also geostationary orbit is even more fragile than low Earth orbit because if you create large debris there, you've got maybe potentially a problem that you can't fix, basically. And this, I don't think anybody wants. So the country started to talk more about what do we do about space resilience, in the United States a lot. How do we improve the resiliency of our assets? Also, resiliency meaning how do we learn to operate, for example, in a degraded environment? If some of our assets are not available, are we still able to operate? Are operators able to do that? And I think people started to talk more about that. But deterrence strategies, how do we better deter irresponsible or malevolent behavior? And also, what would be the mitigation and response options? And these discussions are basically ongoing today. Russia, obviously, if we talk about Russia, that's, they have the ground-based ASATs too, of course. And actually their S-500 missile is supposed to reach up to 600 kilometers, so that's pretty bad too, if it's ever utilized. Co-orbital, if you talk about co-orbital kinetic weapons, I mean, the Soviets have tested over 20 of those back in 1960. So they have all that. What I think is more concerning are these reversible threats and those that we won't talk about. Again, we're talking about hybrid threats for other environments. Those threats are real for space as well. So main concern, obviously, cyber threats to space, and then electromagnetic threats. That means radio frequency interference, intentional jamming, spoofing. And then, we've got also directed energy threats. We've got threats such as lasers or microwaves. The lasers are actually quite real. They have been tested both by Russia and China. So so they have that ability. Also, and interestingly, when I talk about dual-use nature, space situational awareness can also be considered as a hybrid threat, potentially, because the awareness of your enemy's assets or your competitor's assets puts you in a position to conduct certain operations on the ground at a certain moment. So if you know that the overflight is going to be at a certain time of a day, well, you probably conduct a certain operation just before that or after that. So that situational awareness, can help you basically, react in a hybrid manner. And there are lots of examples that's being done and how satellites are being fooled, so to speak, during operations on the ground. And we've got interesting things like proximity and rendezvous operations. The Russians have conducted between 2015 and 2017 interesting maneuvers in a close vicinity of their own debris of their rockets. What they also did is they parked one of their satellites near a commercial telecommunications satellites. Very close. I mean, we're talking maybe 10 kilometers apparently, which is quite close in terms of space. But so that, for example, that made the commercial operator quite uncomfortable in a sense of, because it's not like they declared the purpose of being there. There was no reason to be there. There was not, from a safety perspective, or even from an operations. The Russians didn't declare what the satellite is doing. So things like that are happening constantly, and we don't really have a good sense of messaging to each other in that. And also, there are no rules. It's not like we can say, you Russians cannot park that satellite near the commercial satellite. There's no rule against it. And then it can spur the whole discussion. Should we have safety zones? Should he have keep out zones around satellites? And the question is not so easy, because you don't want to really create keep out zones if you think about it, because that might create a situation that somebody crosses your red line. If you're a military, you don't really want to react if those red lines are crossed. So we have to be very careful also when we then, configure, let's say, some kind of rules for these kind of operations. Anyway, so this just to give you a sense of where we are operating here. So let's look at NATO. So of course, we all know space enables NATO operations. Basically, I don't know about any modern military today that conducts operations without space. That is basically competitive. So satellite communication, positioning, navigation, timing, surveillance, reconnaissance, space situational awareness, missile launch warning, geospatial information, weather prediction, all that is space enabled. What is true for NATO is they don't own any on-orbit assets as an organization. It relies on national and commercial capabilities, and they basically rely on the availability of the asset. So if you talk about, so it's always the nations who are basically priority. So then it's a matter of how do you set it in a way that those space assets are available in certain NATO operations, and you need to communicate that, ideally within the alliance. So, for example, Earth observation, we've got several systems: Starlink, Helios 2, Cosmos Skynet, provided by different European allies for the capacities. Satellite communications, there's an agreement between the British, French, and Italians to provide satellite communications for NATO. Of course, NATO also utilizes commercial companies' information, and they do have ground stations. They own ground terminals and ground stations to support operations. So that's the status today. We can discuss, should NATO actually own on-orbit assets? It's a big question. We can also ask, should European Union, and then we can actually get into the discussion. Should these organizations independently own their assets, and how would they be managed? What does that mean in terms of financial and other coordinations? So now, space as a priority. Okay, I think I put a question mark, and the only reason why I put a question mark is that it hasn't really looked like space is a priority. So because space was kind of always there, It's during the operations. People didn't really think about it in a way. It's just like if you're on the ground operating, you're just utilizing the service, and you really think of it as a domain, separate domain that enables it. But it is obviously now a warfighting domain on its own. And why is that? Because you can actually utilize the domain, but you can also try to disable the domain. And that can create that could mean a victory or not. So I think what is now a discussion in the expert circles is that how do we not only utilize the domain, but how do we actually protect it? And I think that's one of the reasons I think space is also going to become more important in the NATO discussions. Because today, for example, if a national asset is used in a NATO operation, and then an asset is attacked in some major way, we don't really know what that means in terms of responses or reactions. Like, for example, would that mean triggering Article 5 under certain circumstances? We don't have clear answers today. So we need to, in my opinion, we need to actually have tabletop exercises. You know, how would that council meeting look like when we sit there and say, okay, so what kind of international agreements do we have? What does that mean for our reactions, for the military commanders? What should be their responses? Again, space-based information required for NATO planning and operation. I think this is very important for planning. You need space outside of the deployed area. I think this is very important. So not only the guys on the ground using the receivers and using everything, but I think that the planning part is important. And again, more contested space environment. So until today, NATO assumed, not it's their fault because everybody's, the environment is changing so rapidly in a way, is that we all assume we're going to conduct all our operations in a benign environment. That's not the case anymore. So any future NATO operation can be conducted under a contested space domain, which is in a way a little bit, not new, but more urgent than in the past. Changing national and international space perimeters, because a lot of it's now evolving. People are talking about we need to evolve the Outer Space Treaty and the other space treaties that were configured back in the 1960s and 70s. We have to understand better how to regulate the new commercial space. We need to understand better how to improve situational awareness and how to share that kind of information globally, or at least among allies first. And again, I think if space was as a symbol of collaboration within the NATO, it is a pretty powerful symbol of shared values and transatlantic unity. So if we can agree on a lot of things, I think we could agree how to better operate in space. I think that's doable for the alliance. If they set their eyes to it, and they are. So that's the good news. And that's my next slide. Beyond operation and tactics toward a comprehensive policy. And I think that's where NATO is heading. Not maybe at the summit communique, you will probably see space as a separate point, but the NATO countries have already agreed they need a policy. Well, why is that? Well, it's not like they didn't know that they need to maybe protect their space. If you look back already to 2010 strategic concept, it warns about the deployment of technologies that threaten allies' capabilities in space. When you look at the Allied Joint Doctrine for Air and Space Operations, again, increased awareness about the potential of adversaries seeking to exploit their own access to space for military purposes to the detriment of alliance agreement. The thing is, we haven't really analyzed and prepared ourselves what that means for our day-to-day operations within NATO, I think. What I added is that we actually need to focus, sometimes NATO doesn't always focus on particular, I think, enemy per se, so to speak. But I think we have to look at what China and Russia are doing as our competitors. Because if we talk military terms, if there's going to be an attack that is serious, it probably won't come from a rogue actor or some commercial entity or anything like that. I think that will be pretty well planned. And I think I also put in the ENF, and that piggybacks a little bit on what Roger talked about before, but we also need to be aware that the Chinese and Russia are conducting E&F operations in the space sector, and I will talk about that also a little later. So there is something to build on. Also back in 2012, the NATO JAPCC, the Joint Air Competence Center, they came up with a document which was called Handbook for Space Operations. And they actually said a lot of the things that are just being discussed today. You know, how we need to consolidate the space expertise from planning, you know, training, deployment, and everything all together. And how do you basically employ, coordinate, and defend space within the NATO context? So there are things that can be built on. So what I'm proposing, basically, what a policy could include for NATO. And when we look strategically, what do we want? We want to promote transparency and confidence building measures and norms of responsible behavior and best practices. This is what goes back to the China test. I mean, you know, a lot of people use that example, but it's such a great example. Because we don't want to employ really arms control for space. And there's actually a big division between what European countries and the United States believe in terms of what should be done in governance of space versus what China and Russia do. So China and Russia think that we should have a new arms control treaty for space, so-called, they call it DPWT, Treaty on the Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Outer Space. And they are promoting it in international policies. And they're saying we need to ban weapons in space. But if you look at the bottom of that, again, what is weapon in space? A satellite can be a weapon in space. Anything, I mean, anything, so again, and even a behavior can be a weapon if you do it in a certain way, in a certain context. So what the United States and Europeans are saying, well, we better focus on behaviors, you know. So that also then goes to punishment. I mean, should we have a certain norms of behavior, and if they're irresponsible actors, should we have a way how to punish them? And I think this is very important. You should be transparent about your policies, about your doctrines, about the way you feel certain systems. And I think that's very important for all of you who are interested in the diplomatic part and governance part of space, because I think this is where we are today. We can talk about more how that is later, but I think we'll leave that for now. Enhance and expand space partnerships. Again, I think this is a very powerful, you know, not only symbolic event, but also a very strong deterrent. If you know how to build global partnerships for space, you're creating a good deterrent. Because, again, it's then very much harder for your potential competitors or enemies to go after your assets. And if you're actually a substantive collaboration, like actually sharing some systems, let's say like Galileo, potentially, and GPS, okay, then it's much harder to attack such a system, because if that interoperability creates a harder equation for the competitor or the enemy to know the reactions, and it's harder to that. Contribute to strengthening deterrence of allied space assets. Again, through the partnerships, but to actually understand. You know, NATO talks about deterrence a lot. So how do you throw in the space part and create a stronger deterrence through that, configuring actually your strategy and policy for space? And what I say is also configure responses to space hybrid operations. That goes to not only to NATO, but also to individual countries. And again, why we talk about cross-domain? Because I guess it's the case for cyber too, but you don't want to deter an attack in space with an attack in space or through space, because simply the domain is too fragile and the effect is not what what you basically want, because it doesn't get you that desired result. So a lot of now the discussion goes around what kind of cross-domain response options do you have? And not only response option, but deterrence option in terms of preemptive deterrence. And we'll talk about it a little later. And operational level, again, obviously, fully integrated into NATO planning command structure. I think that's pretty clear to NATO today. And NATO personnel should be trained to maximize the exploitation. So again, from the very beginning, until they go and are deployed, because a lot of the support is not in the field. And a lot of those skilled operators have to sit back at home and actually support the troops on the ground. And I think this will be better done when that's more integrated. So I think that kind of summarizes that in terms of what I think. And actually, I would be interested to hear from you if you have any more ideas how to improve that, because those discussions will be had now. How our institute is trying to advance some of these topics, I mean deterrence, space partnerships, responses to space hybrid operations. So I wanted to kind of like put it there. We have an international space security conference series since 2011. I put two pictures. One is the last one in Washington, D.C. in 2017, and the below is the first one in 2011, which was in Prague. What we're trying to do is every 2 years, we're trying to bring in high-level military and government officials, ideally also commercial actors, because industry is very important for that discussion too. And we're trying to see how we can better communicate as allies and how we can be better partners to each other. So we have done 2 conferences in Prague, one in Tokyo and one in Washington, D.C. Next one we plan for next June 2019, again in Prague. Just because people like to come to Prague. Not that they don't like D.C., but in a way, Prague is a little better venue for discussions like that, I think. What we also do, and again, this kind of stems from the whole ENF program that we have, that Roger talked a lot about, is that we're trying to do some research in terms of how do our competitors go around the globe creating space partnership through economic and financial incentives. And what they, for example, do is that they go to countries like Nigeria, Bolivia, Indonesia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, and they say, look, don't you want a better communication infrastructure? We're gonna build you a satellite, we're gonna launch it for you, we're gonna build your ground stations, and we're gonna train your people, and we're gonna give you a loan to do all that. And so what they are doing is cleverly creating a whole vertical integration dependency on their basically providing that to these countries. And oftentimes these countries are desperate to get to space because everybody wants to be in space today. And so they take that as a good opportunity. And oftentimes they go to countries that, are not always, they sometimes might be a little more corrupt, so to say, or authoritarian. So it's not, and it's easy to do that for them because, it's much easier than for the United States or Europe to do that probably. And what we're saying is that we probably want to understand that because we ourselves, that means European countries and the United States, we are actually in the process of wanting to strengthen space partnerships globally, again, because of deterrence, but also because of persuading people that we need to improve governance. And to improve governance, you kind of have to have a common understanding of some kind of space security basics. So we can endlessly talk about whether we want arms control versus behavioral norms. But if we don't have any understanding about the bottom lines, we will never get any agreement on any international body. Okay, so, and building space partnerships will help you do that, to communicate with these countries. Because you would be surprised, a lot of the countries even lack space expertise on the very basic level. So I think that's very interesting too. And then again, research on what Roger was talking about, how Russia and China are, for example, embedded into the Western financial systems, and how you can use that to actually do some of the cross-domain responses. So I think what also Roger mentioned is that today, I think Russia and China assume they can operate on the global financial systems without much penalties. But what if we create a set of tools, like what you mentioned, naming and shaming, or others, or you're raising that reputational and other risks to the companies that fund the space and defense sector of these countries. What if you create that kind of mix, and you can signal to these countries that if you engage in this kind of malevolent behavior, that could hurt your business. And I think this is quite new in the sense that I have not seen that, nobody can figure that. And so if you just put that into that little small space sector, it can be quite effective if you put your mind to it. And highlighting challenges related to space hybrid threats. I think this is a very interesting area, because most people mostly talk about hybrid threats for space in a classified environment. But increasingly, it is deemed as not sufficient because of the nature of the threats and in terms of the need to develop better strategies. So, for example, the United States is currently struggling with the fact that so much of their space is classified that you can't talk about anything outside, little stovepipe circles of people, and they talk to each other. And again, they don't talk about anybody outside. And they increasingly feel that they want to change it. So more and more discussions are in the United States. And we think such discussions are to be had in Europe. So we have actually held a little roundtable in May of this year in Prague on this. And PSSI, we have defined space hybrid operations as intentional, temporary, mostly reversible and often harmful space actions or activities specifically designed to exploit the links to other domains and just below the threshold of requiring a meaningful military or political retaliatory response. And I think this is, the bottom line for other domains too. But again, I think what is important, there are few or if any policy guidelines how to deal with it. And what is also interesting is the links to civil and commercial. So for example, if you are in charge of national security, you gotta think beyond military operations today, because if an enemy is going to go after your country, they're certainly not going to go after it in a military attack today, They're gonna, for example, look, let's see, they are using GPS for their financial transactions, so why don't we disable that for a while? Well, if you imagine disabling it for 24 hours, GPS, that would probably be a pretty much of a collapse of the financial stock and then, the economy would basically collapse within a few days. So we got to think about these things in those terms too. How the competitors and adversaries, mainly the adversaries, obviously competitors are a little different, but how would they use space to create damage? On a small scale, you see that. Obviously, before the Russians went to Ukraine, that's what they did first. They disabled the GPS signals because that was part of the preparations of growth. So that's more of a standard hybrid practices. But we have to think about it more, I think. And the temporary and reversible is a problem, right? Because if it's temporary and reversible, how do you react so fast? And if you want to react later, do you have sufficient, attribution and all that you can do that? Attribution. Again, we've got limited space situation awareness capabilities. So, for example, jamming, everybody says, jamming, that's always been there. Intentional jamming kind of has been part of military operations for a long time. Well, that's maybe true, but we could have on-orbit jamming. which is, so jamming from the ground, okay, you can probably detect it at a certain point. But if you have it on orbit, maybe that kind of creates a little, it's a little harder. Also, we could, then you have a problem like other means. Even if you attribute it, do you want to react? Because you don't really want to maybe do that, to uncover, some information, In terms of attribution, what do you do about what do you do about verification then? Verification of that really happening so that you can react in that way. Again, enhance base situational awareness. So what we're saying, you've got to have some mapping and tracking mechanism of these incidents, because oftentimes, for example, the commercial providers of defense services, they are being attacked. Well, they don't always want to, report all that because they want to preserve their, business. And so, is there any incentive for these commercial guys to actually report incidents like that? If they want to report it, who do they report to? How is that information protected? How can we work with? How can we put it into the bigger picture geopolitics? So we're gonna actually have to have people to do kind of all that, and at the same time persuade the partners, and not only commercial, but maybe our allied partners, that we want to share such information with each other, which we don't always do. So again, better intelligence sharing and SSA. That's going to be again something we will increasingly work with. Because again, for verification, arms control is not going to work. And okay, time. Deterrence, again, look outside space. And I think this goes to cyber domain too. I don't know, maybe Lila will talk about it, how the cyber people think about it, but I don't know whether cyber attack against cyber attacks is smart. I probably wouldn't think so, but hey, she knows more about it. She will maybe talk about it. It's definitely not a good idea in space. So, and then how do you enforce the behavioral norms? You gotta have something that is known and measurable. So you've got to have a norm that is measurable, and then you've got to have a way to verify it through either intelligence sharing or better situational awareness. And then you can actually enforce it. And I suggest for the cross-domain deterrence, again, look at the ENF, and this is what we're basically trying to do for space. So I think with this, I will conclude, because I was told I've been speaking for too long, and we can just discuss for the remaining half an hour things that I haven't even gotten to the whole US and EU landscape, because there are lots of changes ongoing now. I don't know if anybody is following that, but it's just like amazing what's happened in the past year. So we can talk about that too.